Our representative democracies too often do not stand for the majority anymore. Wealthy, powerful, and ideological special interests have captured our political systems. The democratic principle of for the people, by the people, seems to not stand anymore. It's been corrupted. Passing laws to prevent this kind of corruption is difficult because special interests have the resources and the persistence to fight this kind of change. Any legislative victories tend to be short-lived because special interests gradually undo this progress, or they find ways to work around these new laws. Direct democracy is one alternative, but it demands too much time and effort from citizens. We must set up a legislative body that is fundamentally more difficult to corrupt and designed to represent the interests of the majority. But it also must not be as burdensome as direct democracy is. One solution to the problem of political representation is that we can replace our elected representatives with randomly selected citizens. These parliaments will need to be larger, but as a result, they could be more genuinely representative. Selected citizens would decide on one issue in parliament before returning to their regular lives. This kind of change in our political system would also require changes in our media environment. For example, we would want changes in media ownership and media concentration to protect the public from manipulation and disinformation. However, set up appropriately, randomly selected citizen parliaments would reduce political corruption and deliver genuinely representative democracy. This is because it's harder to individually corrupt a large group of people than it is to corrupt a smaller group of people. Lobbyists are at their most effective when they have personal, ongoing relationships with those that they are trying to influence. Power corrupts, and the longer someone is in power, the more likely they are to become corrupted. So a constantly changing group of randomly selected citizens is a good thing because it reduces entrenched corruption. In the worst case scenario, even if an entire group of selected citizens becomes absolutely corrupted, they will only be around to decide on one issue, and then a completely new set of citizens will come to decide the next issue. So even in the absolute worst case scenario, the corruption doesn't last. So a randomly selected parliament is much less likely to be corrupted, and even if it becomes corrupted, the damage that can be done is minimal over the long term. Let's look at the problem in more depth. The main problem with representative democracy, which is what we have now in most democracies around the world, is that wealthy interests have corrupted our representatives. Those politicians that we elect to represent our interests have been bought. Representative democracy is what most democracies are now. We elect people to go off to the parliament and make laws on our behalf. They're supposed to represent our interests. That's why we call them representatives. However, political parties, politicians, and candidates accept money from special interests to fund their election campaigns and to keep their political parties going. Those that receive this money expect us to believe that it does not change their actions and behavior, that it doesn't affect their interests. But people see through this falsehood and recognize that something is wrong with the representative model of democracy. It no longer produces results that actually represent public interests or public opinion or public preferences. Surprising fewer people each year because we're waking up, it produces results that represent the groups that donate the most money. Representative democracy represents the people who pay for the system. Those are the wealthy interests that provide the campaign financing and the money to keep political parties going. The main problem of representative democracy is that it is too easy to corrupt our representatives. Another problem with representative democracy is that representatives are not actually representative of voters. There's several ways this is true. First, representatives as a group are very rarely demographically characteristic of voters. This we call descriptive representation. Elected representatives are usually older, male, and they are members of the dominant ethnic, linguistic, and/or religious group within society. And that changes from society to society. Elected representatives tend to have higher incomes. They tend to be educated in a much narrower set of disciplines, often law, and they come from higher socioeconomic classes compared with the rest of society. So these representatives of ours, they move in different circles than the rest of the population. They associate with elite groups in society, and they live within information bubbles that do not acknowledge diverse perspectives that exist in the entire population. There are, of course, individual exceptions, but when we compare the average statistics of representatives and voters as a whole in the population, those differences between representatives and the population are pretty obvious. Representatives tend to have different worldviews, priorities, and beliefs about the issues that matter to the population and to voters, to the things that most people consider important. Second, representatives do not promote the policy preferences of most voters. Most often, this is because of the influence of money in politics. But it can also be due to religious beliefs, ideological beliefs, and the fact that the demographic representation of politicians is quite different. If we look at what our parliamentarians look like now, the elected ones, they don't represent the population. Another problem is that politicians need to follow the party lines to keep their positions in power. If an elected politician steps out of line with what the political party wants them to say, they can be kicked out of the party, lose all funding and the support that goes along with that. And so there's a strong incentive, even if on a personal level a representative might disagree with the party platform, they rarely step out of line. Politicians need to follow party lines to keep their positions. Yet another problem is that greed and conflicts of interest surrounding the investment decisions of some parliamentarians can put them at odds with public interests. This is when they have insider knowledge because of their position as a lawmaker, allows them to make investments that the rest of us can't make because we don't know what is being debated inside Parliament. So this aligns the interests of representatives with the business interests of the day. The consequence of all this is that representatives tend not to represent voters demographically or substantively on the issues and policies that matter to voters. And the longer that representatives are in power, the farther they drift away from the average voter. The deeper their bias, the stronger their corruption, and the more misaligned they are from what voters want. One proposed solution to representative democracy, what we have now, is something called direct democracy. Direct democracy is when all citizens vote on all decisions. And as you can imagine, that is a major burden. The main problem with direct democracy is that it demands too much time and effort from everyone. We sometimes do use direct democracy when we have referendums on certain topics. This is when we vote on the decisions ourselves and the whole population gets involved in deciding. It means that the population makes a decision rather than the representatives voting on our behalf. However, if we have to do this for every decision that parliaments make, it would be impractical. Parliaments make hundreds of decisions every year, and to ask every single citizen to get educated about hundreds of topics every year is just not practical. To be informed voters, people would have to read every draft bill. They would need to research every topic, many of which they know little about and care little about. Then voters would have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages to consider the consequences of the different choices and decisions that need to be made for hundreds of issues every year. There would be no end to this process, and there would be a new topic almost every single day. Politics is difficult, the problems are complex, and often there is no easy answer or no clear solution. Compromises have to be made. In voluntary voting systems, most people would not participate in direct democracy because it's too burdensome. It takes too much time and effort. So in voluntary electoral systems that move to direct democracy, it would be very, very bad. Most people wouldn't be involved and the whole system would fail because people would check out, but a select number of people would be engaged and they would make all of our choices for us. We would just replace one set of problems with a different set of problems. And if our direct democracy was a compulsory system, people would not be able to get on with their regular lives, perform their regular roles as in society, in their jobs. They wouldn't have enough time for families. Under a compulsory voting system and direct democracy, people would become exhausted and have less time for other aspects of their life. They would not have time for their regular jobs, family obligations, or leisure activities. This would remain true even if decisions were made at the lowest possible level. There are simply too many decisions that need to be made each year. Making everyone decide on every law is just not practical, especially in large, complex modern societies. So the main problem of direct democracy is that it would demand too much time and effort from citizens. It wouldn't work if it were under a voluntary voting system, and it would just be a massive burden if it were in a compulsory voting system.